Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series we're going to cover how to remove filters in measures. So the video is really all about how to use the All and RemoveFilters functions. We're going to show you three main things in this video: how to remove all the filters in a measure, how to remove filters from specific tables, and how to remove filters from single specific columns. We'll throw a few other techniques in along the way to show you the point of doing all this, so let's get started. I've started by creating a new report, and I've already imported all the data from the Excel Movies workbook that we've been using for previous parts of this series. I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this file yourself and follow along with the video if you'd like to. All I've done since importing the data is tidied up in the data model view a little bit, and I've also made sure to hide all the ID columns so that they don't clutter up the fields list when we're in the report view. I'm just going to head back to the report view to get started with creating a measure, and the first measure we're going to create is going to calculate the total runtime minutes of our films. So I'm going to right click the All Measures table and choose to create a new measure, and then in the formula bar let's create a new measure called total runtime. And we'll simply make this equal to the result of the sum function, looking for the film runtime minutes field. Now that I've created a new measure in that table, I can delete the delete me column and convert this table into a proper measures table. And then, when I've confirmed that I want to do that, I'm going to display the measure we've just created on a simple card. So I'm going to add a card visual to the report page and then assign the total runtime field or measure to that card. Now you probably already know from watching previous parts of this series that the value displayed by a measure can be affected by filters. And the filters which affect a measure can come from a range of different sources. A fairly obvious place to start is in the filters panel. Here we can choose to assign a filter which would affect either just a single visual, all the visuals on the same page, or even all the visuals on all the pages in the entire report. As a quick simple example, I'm going to head over to the certificate table in the fields list and drag the certificate field into the filters on this page bucket. Once I've done that, I have a fairly easy, obvious way to assign filters to all the visuals on the page just by checking a box next to the certificate I'm interested in. And you can see that as I do that, it changes the results displayed by the measure. I can quickly and easily clear all the filters by clicking the clear filter button there, and then I get back to the original result. It's also possible to use other visualizations on the same page to filter the result of a measure. You may remember again from previous videos that visualizations on the same page interact with each other. Some visuals in fact are designed purely to act as filters, such as the slicer visual. To draw a slicer, I'm just going to click away from my card first of all, and then I'm going to draw a slicer on the page, and then let's assign the country field from the country table to that slicer. Apologies, the font size is a little small, but it's enough to get the idea, I think. If I now click on a country in the slicer, you can see once again it affects the result displayed by that measure. And again, if I hold down the control key, I can include multiple values in the same selection and get a different result each time I add a new country. Again, I can then clear that filter by clicking the clear filter button and get back to the original result. As well as these external filters which can affect the result of a measure, you can also generate filters within the visual that the measure is displayed within. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to add a basic table to the report. So I'm going to add a table, and then I'm just going to assign my basic total runtime measure to it. And just to make it vaguely readable, I think I will increase the font size of that using the Format pane. So I'll head to the Values section and change the font size up to about 13, and hopefully that will be big enough to read. So at the moment we're seeing the total runtime of all the films. If I wanted to generate a filter context within the same visual, all I need to do is add another field to it. So in this case I'm going to go to the genre table and I'm going to drag the genre field and position that just before the total runtime measure. And you can see that that same measure now is displayed 24 times, once for each genre, as well as one extra time for the grand total, which is the same as the value being displayed up here. So in the different genre rows, the filter context that's generated automatically influences the results of the same measure. So what if you wanted to create a measure which isn't affected by filters? This is quite a common requirement in DAX in Power BI, and there are several functions which are designed to allow you to manipulate the way filters work. Let's start by adding a new measure to the All Measures table. And I want to calculate again the total runtime, but this time without it being affected by filters. So let's call it something like total runtime with no filters. Oh, I suppose we could do it the way the kids do on Instagram, couldn't we? We could do #NoFilters, and we can try to sound young and trendy. I suspect it may be a little too late for me to get away with that. Anyway, let's go with the calculate function, which again you may remember from the previous video, allows you to calculate an expression modified by filters. The expression we're going to calculate is the total runtime, so we could refer to our existing measure called total runtime, or we could nest the sum function inside this calculate function and calculate the runtime minutes here. We can then enter a comma, and on the next line we can choose how to influence the filters. We want to remove the filters, all the filters from this measure, and there are two functions we can use to do that. The older of the two functions is called all. The all function actually serves two different purposes in DAX. When you nest it as a filter argument in, for example, a calculate function, as we're doing here, the job of the all function is simply to remove all the filters applied to that measure. So we could just say all, open and close some round brackets, and then close the extra set of round brackets for the calculate function. Now the all function also serves a completely different purpose if you use it in a different context. So to avoid confusion, DAX introduced a separate function called RemoveFilters. Now RemoveFilters only ever appears as a filter argument. Its only job is to remove filters. So it doesn't serve two purposes like all. You'll only ever find it in this sort of situation. The syntax is the same, it's just the function name, and then the simplest way to apply it is just to open and close a set of round brackets to remove all the filters in that measure. So it's entirely your choice, either all or remove filters, either will work. When you press enter to create your measure, you can then display that in several different ways. So let's add another card and add our total runtime #NoFilter. You see it gives you the same result as the original measure. We could also apply this to our table. So we head to the table object and then add the total runtime #NoFilters. This time you will see a slightly different result. Hopefully you can see that every single genre now is displaying the total runtime for all the films. So the filter context that's generated by the genre field is being ignored. You'll also see that the card ignores any filters we apply externally as well. If we select countries in our slicer, it affects the original measure, but not the new one. Again, as the name suggests, we're removing all filters from that measure. Just to complete the picture, again, of course, if we apply filters using the filters pane, it won't affect our new measure, but it will still affect the original one that we created. Now, the point of doing this sort of thing is usually so that you can compare a filtered measure with an unfiltered one. So, for example, what if we wanted to work out the contribution of each genre's runtime to the grand total? Now that we've got the ability to calculate the grand total for each genre context, we can simply divide the total for that genre with the grand total. So let's create another new measure, and I'm going to call this one runtime percentage of total, or something along those lines. I can't think of a sensible Instagram hashtag to use for that one, so let's go with a slightly more boring title, runtime percentage of total. And we can make this one equal to the result of the divide function. And then the numerator is going to be the total runtime. So again, we could reference our original measure, total runtime, or we could nest the sum function in here again and refer to the runtime minutes field. The denominator will be the second measure. So again, we could reference our total runtime #NoFilters measure, or we could rebuild it here using the calculate function. So let's go with a slightly longer approach. We'll say calculate sum runtime minutes. And then the filter we'll apply to that is to remove filters. It's entirely up to you whether you want to make use of your existing measures. It probably makes sense to do so if you've gone to the effort of creating them, but appreciate you might not always build up the measures step by step. So having done that, we can create that measure, and then let's make sure it's formatted in an appropriate way. It wants to be formatted as a percentage. And I want to make sure there's 2 decimal places, which happens to be the default, so that's good. And then we can simply assign this new measure to our existing table, and then we should hopefully see the contribution of each genre's runtime to the grand total by dividing these 2 columns. We don't need to display those 2 columns, of course. We could remove those and just display the percentage amount. So removing all the filters from a measure is fairly straightforward, but what if you only want to remove certain filters? To demonstrate that, let's create a new page in the report. I'm going to hide my filters panel just to give myself a bit more space to design a new visual. Let's add a matrix to the page. And into that matrix, I'm going to assign the genre field to the rows bucket, the certificate field to the columns bucket, and the original total runtime measure to the values bucket. I just increase the size of that visual, and then let's also bump up the font size again from the format pane to the values area, and then change the font size to 13. We can hopefully once again see that the filter context generated by the genre field and the certificate field has produced a different result for each place that measure appears. Let's just quickly copy and paste that matrix. And then I'm going to replace the total runtime measure with the total runtime no filters measure. Just so again we can see that all of the filters have been removed. So we get the grand total runtime for everything in every single cell. What I'd prefer to do for this example, I want to work out each genre's contribution to the total of the column. So the contribution of each genre to the total of all the genres. So basically in the first column of that matrix, I want to see the grand total for 12A films, 31,095, and then subsequently for each of the other columns. To do that, let's create a new measure to calculate the total runtime for all the genres. The good news here is we can kind of cheat a little bit and copy and paste, because the basic pattern of this is identical to removing all filters. We just need to be a little bit more specific about which filter we want to remove. So I'm going to copy all the code we wrote for the no filters measure, and then right click the all measures table and choose to create a new one. Paste in what we've just copied, and then change its name to say something like total runtime all genres. I can't think of a clever hashtag for this one, I'm afraid. We'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. Now the good news about both the remove filters and the all functions, we can use either function again here. They are completely interchangeable in a filter argument of a calculate function. I'm going to stick with my remove filters function though, and then pass in the name of the table whose filters I want to remove. So I want to remove all the filters applied by the genre table in this case. So once I've done that, I can update my measure to create it. And then we can replace once again the no filters measure in that matrix with my total runtime all genres. And we should be able to see now that we've got the grand total for the column displayed for every genre for that particular certificate. The final step once again would be to compare the filtered measure with the unfiltered one. So to do that, let's create another new measure. And I can't think of a sensible or clever hashtag name for this one. Let's just call it runtime percentage of all genres. And we can make this one equal to the result of the divide function. And I'm going to refer to my existing measures this time, the 2 that we're looking at in our current matrices on this page. So that's going to be the total runtime divided by the total runtime all genres. Close the round brackets and hit enter to create the measure. Make sure that it's got the percentage formatting applied to it with hopefully 2 decimal places. And then once again, we can replace the measure we're currently displaying in the values area of that matrix with the runtime percentage of all genres. And there we go. So we're getting the contribution to the column, basically, with this particular arrangement of fields. We can use the same basic technique to remove filters from multiple tables in the same measure. So let's say we wanted to remove filters applied by both the genre table and the certificate table at the same time. To do this, let's just quickly cheat once again. I'm going to copy and paste the total runtime all genres measure, and then create a new measure and paste in all that code and then just update its name. So we'll call this one total runtime all genres and certificates. Now, you can't write a comma-separated list of multiple tables in either the RemoveFilters or the All functions. If I try to refer to the certificate table, we get an error indicating it's the wrong type of parameter. You can write multiple arguments in a RemoveFilters and All function, but you can only write a comma-separated list of columns, not of tables. So to make this work, what we'd need to do is rely on the fact that you can apply multiple filter arguments in the calculate function. So I can type in a comma at the end of the first RemoveFilters and then use again either RemoveFilters or All, this time refer to the certificate table, and then that will remove all filters from the certificate table too. I'm just going to create that measure, and then let's use that in place of our existing one in the second matrix here. So let's swap out these two new measures. So what we'll see there is, as we saw earlier on in fact, the grand total runtime of all the films. Now we saw this earlier, didn't we, with the total runtime hashtag no filters. But the difference between these two measures is that the hashtag no filters one removes every single filter applied by every single field and table. This one only removes filters applied by the certificate table and the genre table. So it's probably easiest to demonstrate that using a slicer on the page. I'm going to take away this original matrix, and then in its place I'm going to put a slicer that shows the list of countries. Then we can see that with this new measure applied, the one that only removes filters from the certificate and genre tables, if I select a country such as Australia, it filters the result, so it shows me the grand total runtime minutes for only Australian films. Likewise, if I selected Thailand, just the grand total for Thailand films, etc, etc. So the difference here then, if I go back to the second matrix and replace the total runtime all genres with the total runtime hashtag no filters, if I now choose the country of Australia, we'll see that it has no influence on the final result there whatsoever. It's still showing us the grand total runtime of absolutely every single film. So the final step of all this then, of course, would be to divide the original total runtime measure with the result of the new one we've just created. That's fairly straightforward to do, so we might as well quickly do it. Let's just once again cheat and copy and paste the runtime percentage of all genres measure. And then we can paste that in as a new measure, modify its name. So we'll say all genres and certificates. And then just change the name of the measure we're using for the second argument here to total runtime, all genres and certificates. Okay, so there we go. We can create that. Make sure that it's got the percentage formatting applied to it with a couple of decimal places, and then once again swap out the measures we're displaying in that matrix. So we've seen how to remove all the filters from a measure and how to remove filters from a specific table. But we can be even more specific than that and remove filters from a single column. I'd like a new example to demonstrate this, so let's create a new page in the report, and I'm going to add a basic table, and in the table I'm going to insert the Oscar nominations field from the film table. Now by default that will summarise the Oscar nominations with a sum function, but I don't want to summarise that, I want to show one row for each value in the Oscar nominations field. So having done that, let's just bump up the font size a bit so we can see what's going on. And then I'd like to simply count how many films have received that number of nominations. I'm going to use a basic measure to do that, using the count rows function to count the number of rows in the film table with that number of nominations. So we can add a new measure to the measures table. We'll call this one count of films and make it equal to count rows using the film table. We can then insert that into the table visual. And I'd like to be able to filter that table using a couple of slicers with fields from the film table. So I'm going to insert a new slicer, and I'm going to use the runtime minutes field from the film table first. That gives me a nice little slider. And then I wanted another slicer using the film's release date. So let's add a new slicer, and let's include the release date field. And I'll position this just below my runtime minutes slicer. and then just have a quick check to make sure that when we change the values in the sliders, that influences the results displayed in that table. Let's just clear both slicer filters, and then we'll look at how we can remove filters from just a single specific column. My aim here is to be able to show these counts of films as a percentage of the total of the column. I still want to be able to influence the results by using the runtime minutes and release date filters, so the only filter I want to remove is that applied by the Oscar nominations column. So let's look at how we just get the count first of all. We've got a couple of approaches we could take here. If I add a new measure to the all measures table, I'm going to call this one count films all nominations, or something along those lines. Let's shorten it to all noms actually, so I don't have to type in nominations. And we could use the calculate function as we've been doing previously. So we can say calculate and then use the count rows function to look at the film table. And then we could apply a filter, or I suppose remove a filter, using the remove filters function. Now it's not sufficient here to remove all the filters from the film table, because of course that would then ignore the filters applied by our slicers, runtime minutes and release date. So I want to specifically remove the filter applied by the Oscar nominations column. If I then close the round brackets for the remove filters function and again for the calculate function, we can add this new measure into our table and see that we get the result of 1200 for each row. Now the important thing here is that if we change the slicer values, the grand total calculated matches the grand total for the count of films. So if we just removed all the filters from the film table, of course, that wouldn't work. So now that we've done that, we can take the standard approach of dividing the count, the original measure, the base measure, with the new one with its removed filters. So that's nice and straightforward to do. Let's just create a new measure, and we'll call this one count of films, or count films percentage of all noms. My names are getting worse and worse, I think. Well, apart from the hashtag one, I suppose. So let's go with a divide, and then we'll say the count of films divided by the count of films all noms. We'll create that, and then apply the percentage format with 2 decimal places, and then we can simply assign that to our table, providing enough space to see the results. And there we go. And once again, the point of all this is that the only filter that's been removed is the one applied by the Oscar nominations field. Now it's worth mentioning here that although we've been using the calculate function for all of our demonstrations, all the techniques we've covered here work equally well with the CalculateTable function. And just because of the example I've created here, we've got a nice opportunity to show you that that's the case. So I'm going to select my count films all nominations measure. And I'm going to change it completely. Rather than using the calculate function with the count rows function nested inside it, I'm going to replace that with a count rows function which calculates the table that it counts the rows of. So we'll start with count rows, and then we'll embed a CalculateTable function which uses the film table as its base. We can then apply filters to the CalculateTable function, just like with the calculate function, and the filter we want to apply is to remove filters from the nominations or film Oscar nominations column. So the end results of this will be identical to that generated with the original measure, but just to demonstrate that this works either way round and that you can remove filters in the CalculateTable function as well. Finally, I'd just like to quickly show the syntax for removing filters from multiple columns in the same measure. I'm going to rearrange this table that we've currently got displayed. I'm going to take away the count films percentage of all nominations and then the count films all noms and replace that, or just leave the Oscar nominations and count of films. I'm then going to change this into a matrix, and then I'd like to place the Oscar wins field in the columns bucket of the field well. So let's drag Oscar nominations into the columns bucket. I'm also just going to remove the filters from my 2 slicers as well to bring back everything again. Okay, what I'd now like to do is create a measure which shows the count of all the films, removing the filters from the Oscar nominations and the Oscar wins, but only those 2 columns. So let's head back up to the all measures table. And then I think once again, we can cheat a little bit with this. I'm going to copy the count films all noms and then create a new measure and then paste in that same code. I can say all noms and wins, or I guess we could have said count films all Oscars or all Oscar values, but let's go with that, all noms and wins. And then to remove multiple filters from multiple columns, using either the remove filters or the all function, you can write a comma separated list of column names. So I can say film Oscar nominations and film Oscar wins. Okay, so that's the final measure created. Nothing complicated there at all. This works equally well with the calculate table or with the calculate functions. It really doesn't matter too much. So having created that, let's make a copy of this matrix. Just make it a little bit smaller so we'll be able to see it a little more clearly. And then if I replace the count of films measure there with the count films all noms and wins, we should see that we get 1200 for each cell, but that's affected when we apply filters using our two slicers. So, of course, the final step would be to perform the division of the original measure with that new one that we've just created, but I think we've probably done that enough times in this video that you get the idea. So there we go. There's how you remove filters from measures using either the remove filters or the all functions. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.